My name is Richard Stubbe. I am the Houston Bureau Chief for Bloomberg News and would like to thank the people who invited me here. And I'm your moderator. So you're not here to, I'm going to ask some questions and I'm not going to tell you very much about what I think. So, at any rate, the topic is 10 Wars to Watch in 2015, which is Jean-Marie, that's a rather depressing way to look at the world and to make a list of 10 wars to watch, but unfortunately we have them. I guess the first thing I'd like to know is how you go about choosing.
Well, sadly it's hard to make the choice because we could draw up a list of 20 wars easily in today's world. That was not always the case. After the end of the Cold War, there was a real trend toward much less conflict. And we saw that for most of the post-Cold War period. But in the last 4 or 5 years, there's definitely a trend which is in the opposite direction, which is for more conflicts. And that's why every year, making that list of 10 wars to watch is getting harder. When I look at the 10 conflicts that we identified, some, I would say, they are at the meeting place of local grievances and global strategic concerns. When you look at the situation in Ukraine, Ukraine has been, almost since its independence, a somewhat dysfunctional country with a lot of corruption. The state wasn't reformed after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that was a breeding ground for what we saw then in eastern Ukraine. But that would have remained just a local conflict if you did not have, on top of that, then the deterioration between East and West, a Russian perspective on how to deal with its neighborhood, as it calls it, its close neighborhood. And that is that combination that makes Ukraine today one of the most serious crises of the world, and it had to be on our list. When I look at Syria, Iraq, the Islamic State, very different, but also a combination of two things. You have grievances in Iraq of Sunnis who feel abused and who have been abused by Shia militias. So very local dimension. In Syria, you have, again, Sunni who feel abused and who are abused by an Alawite regime that is a ruthless dictatorship. So again, very local dimensions, but then you have a transnational movement that piggybacks, so to speak, on those very local grievances. And what was something quite local becomes an issue of global concern. It should have been an issue for us anyway, because it's an enormous humanitarian crisis, but it also becomes a strategic crisis. Another conflict that is in the list and that is less well known in the United States is the whole question of Libya and the Sahel. There you have in Libya, tribal state, irreconcilable differences between various parts of the country, Sahel, problems that have been around for decades, which suddenly become a great opportunity again for transnational jihadist movement. And that in a way is part of the mission of Crisis Group, is that we focus on local conflicts, but more and more, as we look at those local conflicts, we see the risk that they morph into something much bigger. And so the ethical demand that we try to stop wars that are a terrible scourge for the people who are directly affected by it becomes also a strategic imperative. Because if we don't address those issues that seem at the beginning to be very local, then at some point they come to haunt us. And so that's part of the rationale behind the list that you see in this 10 Wars to Watch.
Well, it sounds like in any of those places, and Ambassador Pickering, maybe you can speak to this, that the initial problem is a failure of the local or regional government.
Yeah, I think that what lies behind these conflicts is complicated. But I think Jean-Marie has pointed out some of them in one way or another, a reflection of local conflicts, tribal, ethnic differences. And more deeply than that, many of them are products in part at least, of underdevelopment, things that might be characterized by words like poverty, growth, and development, and the issues of health and water, and in food, and they lead into a wide variety of transnational movements that in one way or another are also reflected. So you have immigration taking place, you have narcotics trafficking, and they're linked, and trade problems. So it's important to see these as very complex situations. And again, as Jean-Marie remarked, I think it's important, there is what I would call big power international interest in many of these issues. Some of it happily constructive, some of it unhappily very destructive. There are arms traders. There are people in search of crisis minerals, rare earths, diamonds, and gold. And so, in effect, all of what we see going on in the world in one way or another that looks at instability and helps to generate instability and uncertainty is part of that set of issues. The recent growth in conflict, I think, is a combination. I think in some ways we went through a period not too long ago where we thought military force was the answer to solving essentially divisive and diplomatic problems. Didn't work out very well, but it set a very bad precedent. And in some cases that meant that our resources to deal with conflicts in other countries were diverted. And so one can count the cost of that in a very broad way. Now, U.S. is not responsible for all international conflicts taking place everywhere. But as a world leader, almost everybody looks at us for the first say in how to deal with conflicts. They want to know, where is the U.S., where does it sit, is it going to become involved? And to some extent, this is totally flattering. And to some extent, it's highly unrealistic because we are not in a position in this day and age to take on every world conflict and take it to a solution, however hard that might be. It takes people, it takes money, it takes a commitment, it takes sometimes military forces just to protect and defend people. These are huge burdens. And I think coming in the future, and I think one of the lessons of these 10 conflicts is, how should we be thinking on the basis of the crisis group work and their assessments and analysis about how we're going to deal with these questions in the future? But I think it is extremely important that we begin to think more of cooperation with other countries in trying to get to the bottom of some of these conflicts. A number of them we're going to let fester, unfortunately, because we have neither the capability, nor the interest, nor the will, nor the commitment to go after them.
As you said, the U.S. can't get involved in every conflict, but it can get involved in any conflict.
Yes, it's true. And any conflict can involve us if it tries hard.
Yes.
And the other thing is, because I was just about to go there, and I think it picks up on your point, we are in a revolution in information. And one can see maybe 15, 20 years ago, there were conflicts in many places that never appeared. Now the way in which information flows, and I think the very persuasive capacity that information brings into domestic politics in this country and around the world, is something that in fact makes us immediately aware of these kinds of tragic circumstances, what's going on, and what to do with them. The really interesting thing, however, is that maybe this is neither good nor bad. There are so many that we have the crise du jour, the crisis of the day, and then they disappear, and then they come back again.
We tend to overreact to the suddenness of information. Part of my job is covering oil and oil prices, and one of the things that astonishes me is that a minister from a country around the world can say something, and in 2 minutes there will be an adjustment that will be factored in, that people will sell and buy based on those comments, and that also applies maybe in greater scope to to the conflicts as the information moves as quickly as it does.
And terrorist groups have also understood that.
Perfectly. Yeah.
And that's what where it gets very dangerous, because terrorism has been around for centuries. But now a terrorist attack in one particular place can have immediate global implications. And that is new, and that is linked to the information revolution.
Absolutely.
We talked earlier, and we agreed to start talking about Ukraine as our lead topic. And Jean-Marie, in January, you wrote there were glimmers of hope in Ukraine. Some bad things have happened since then, including the assassination of Boris Nemtsov. So, what's your assessment of the current status there now?
Well, I think we have to recognize that there is a fundamental disagreement between Russia and Western countries on what is, the status quo and what should be the state of affairs in Europe. And so I think one should not underestimate the depth of the confrontation at the moment. After the end of the Cold War, nobody was under the illusion that balance of power considerations had disappeared. They were always there, and they will always be there. But there was nevertheless some hope that a rule-based order would be developed, and that on that basis there would be a cooperative relationship with Russia. And that is what is today unraveling. It started in, I would say, with the Georgia war in 2008. So it's been, there were signs of that before, but now we see it really in a major crisis. And of course, one can say that a number of mistakes were made in handling Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. That will be for historians to write who lost Russia. And I personally believe that we could have handled the whole process differently. But here we are now, with a need to make sure that no miscalculation leads to something worse than what we have now. And that should be our first objective. You don't want, through a series of miscalculations, to find yourself in a situation where a NATO country would be under direct threat of Russia, with risks that would bring us back to, let's say, the Cuban Missile Crisis. You certainly don't want that.
How do you avoid that?
In Syria, President Obama said, I have this red line, and if you cross it, bad things are going to happen. And the line was crossed. And how do you make a credible threat?
There was a NATO summit that took a series of quite concrete decisions that are visible already on the ground in the Baltic states and in Poland. I think there has to be very close coordination between the Europeans and the United States on that, to make sure that there is one unified message and no ambiguity on that. I think that's one element of the policy, which is very important for global peace. I think there are other elements. There is Ukraine. We would want all Ukraine to develop into a democratic, European, prosperous country. And at this stage, it sounds Panglossian and naive.
I was going to ask what your second choice was.
Well, it depends what the time frame is, frankly. If you ask me whether in 1 year from now Ukraine will be what I describe, I'd say obviously not. If we look 20 years down the road, if we are steady, if we have a coherent policy of supporting Ukraine economically, of pushing for reforms, why not? And then you can actually turn the situation around, because if one looks, again, long term, short term, this is naive and doesn't make sense. But long term, the best interest of Russia is to integrate with the rest of Europe, to transform its economy. Russia remains an undiversified economy, much too dependent on raw materials and energy. Its interest is to connect to the European markets, to connect to European technology, to connect to Western technology, to US technology. That is the obvious long-term interest of Russia. At the moment, it's taking the opposite road. A prosperous Ukraine it can be seen short term as a great threat to Russia because it tells the Russian that there is another model for running a country. And that may be one of the rationale behind the present destabilization of Ukraine. But it can also be a bridge to Russia. If the prosperity of Ukraine, then you have in the western part of Russia, you have new zones, economic zones. You can see all that. At the moment, it's a pie in the sky. It's not going to happen. But what we need to do, nevertheless, is consolidate Ukraine economically, and then leave open the framework for an evolution of Russia. I don't think that evolution is going to come quickly. I think that would be completely unrealistic to believe that. But I think that the successful policies of the Cold War, if someone had said in 1950 that the Berlin Wall, I mean, there was no Berlin Wall in 1961, but if someone had said in 1961 that the Berlin Wall would disappear not through war, but just collapse, nobody would have believed that in the middle of the Cold War, and it happened. And I think today we are at a very low point, a very dangerous point, and that's why I started by saying that it's very important that NATO send a clear message. But a low and dangerous point, at the same time we have to think long term. And the long term is to bring Russia back in the community of nations. So there is an element of containment and deterrence, and there is an element of cooperation, and both have to be there.
Let me offer just two comments, because I agree with what Jean-Marie has said, and my thinking has evolved very much the same way. I think that as long as, in fact, we're going to deal with Ukraine, we have to start probably with something like Minsk. And Minsk means an end to fighting. It hasn't worked. Mr. Putin has made promises that he hasn't been willing to deliver on. But let us say continued pressure pushes in that direction. I think the next step is the one that Jean-Marie outlined, and I think there needs to be genuine economic reform. And I think that a group of players can be very important to Ukraine. The Bank and the Fund, the European Bank, the EU, the US, but I would insist on inviting Russia. They have to be told that they have a responsibility, and they have to be made clear that we are not excluding them from Ukraine, but they have to play with the other players. And I think that they won't play. I think Putin will say no, and yet. But nevertheless, it's there. I think secondly, we ought to think, as Jean-Marie said, about the Ukraine as a bridge country. Neither European Union nor Russian sphere. But a number of economists have written some interesting articles about how Ukraine could, with some adjustments and some pain, become a kind of trading possibility in both directions. And I think that's useful to think about. I think that we ought to persuade the Ukrainians to be more upfront, although I think President Poroshenko has helped in treating all their citizens fairly, that kind of thing. No discrimination on language. And I think to help him evolve the autonomy piece. But none of that can happen without an end to fighting, and I think that's significant. I think on the Russian side, my view is that President Putin's first and overwhelming priority is staying on the job. He and Prime Minister Netanyahu have similar characteristics. And that his strategy for staying on the job is to do a couple of things. One, to emphasize Russian nationalism. And the negative of that is the West of the world has treated us badly. And unfortunately, and Jean-Marie is right, there are circumstances in which they were not treated well. I think the denunciation of the ABM treaty was a serious mistake. But that raised questions in Russia. Were we seeking a first strike capacity against them? And their strategic thinkers are permitted, like ours, to worst case everything. And so that's where we ended up. I think secondly, he is mesmerized by this idea of creating some new sphere of economic influence. And he would like to incorporate all of the states of the former Soviet Union, with possible exception of the Baltics. Although the Baltics, and I think Jean-Marie was referring to this, members of NATO now is the place where the confrontation could really spark. And we need to be very, very careful. It is a question of our being absolutely committed to Article 5 of the NATO treaty, and make it very clear that an attack on the Baltics would be an attack on us. And it has to be repeated daily somehow to Mr. Putin. And we have to show we're prepared to do it, and the Europeans, and we are not necessarily totally aligned on that position. But I think with Putin, if you don't draw a tough line and stick with it, he's going to nibble you to death in salami slices.
I'm surprised in conversations like this at how similar they are in conversations about parents and how to deal with 5-year-olds on the playground. And I do want to move on from Ukraine. We've got a fair amount to cover, and I was told that the best way to win over the audience is to finish on time, and that is
but no, I would say just one thing. If you haven't had 2-year-olds, you don't know how to deal with North Korea.
But I do have one more question. You mentioned, Jean-Marie, that Russia is dependent on exports of oil and natural gas, but Europe is dependent equally or nearly equally on imports of those same items. How do you break that link?
First, I would say that Russia is more dependent on Europe than Europe is dependent on...
But Mr. Putin has only now discovered that.
Yes. Second, I think because there is that mutual dependence, the last thing that Putin will do is to really cut off the supply of oil and gas to Europe, and especially gas. I think that's the last thing it will do. I think at the same time, it would be prudent for the Europeans to diversify, to build the LNG terminals that cannot. I'm speaking in a town where people know much more about that than I do, but I know that of course you can't do that overnight, but it can be done. You have to also, there are modifications to be done in the network of pipelines so that they can work in both ways. I mean, there's a range of technical issues that many people in the audience, I'm sure, know better than I do, that can be done for the Europeans to limit their dependency. I think they can also, in terms of reserves, I mean, reserves have been built on a national basis. For instance, I know Germany has considerable reserves in former salt mines. One has to see, and that's a tricky one, but how the risk can be pooled shared between the Europeans. So I think there are a number of practical things that have to be done, that should be done in the next couple of years to limit the dependence and the leverage that Russia has.
Putin is very vulnerable for his failure to diversify the Russian economy, and essentially he's used the oil money for other purposes, sometimes lining the pockets of his supporters, which in fact he has almost admitted that corruption is the device that makes the Russian system work for him. Hard thing. He said 4 years ago, we have corruption and I can't do anything about it. He couldn't do anything about it because in fact he's used corruption to bring into line all of his cronies to make things happen.
When you're the beneficiary of the system, you're not the one who's likely to change the system.
Exactly right.
Exactly.
And I think that Jean-Marie is right that he is now more dependent on the market and will be as long as oil supplies continue to be plentiful. When it reverses, he will do his best to extract as much as he possibly can. But there are other things going on. Look, if there were a possibility of a serious agreement with Iran, like there is, but I don't think it's certain, then Iranian oil would come back on the market, the way Iraqi oil has come back on the market, the way I hope Libyan oil will come back on the market, the way I hope that shale will continue to be able to provide enough swing oil to keep prices within reason. And it couldn't happen to a nicer guy that Mr. Putin is going to have to live for a while with $50 oil or $40 oil or whatever it's going to be. His budget was all regulated at a much higher price.
$50 oil is less popular in Houston than it is in some other locales, but I understand that there are a lot of other people outside Houston who are benefiting.
You have service stations here too.
We do, we do indeed. So let's globe hop a little bit. The number 2 on your list was the Islamic State and Syria and Iraq and how all that is unfolding. And one of the things that you wrote was that the success of Islamic State is a symptom of deeper problems that are not amenable to military solutions. What kind of solutions what's the start of the solution there?
Well, the Islamic State, it's a problem in the Middle East. It's a problem in our own countries. I mean, I am French and I've seen the terrorist attacks in Paris, and the terrorists who committed those attacks were French-born. And among the terrorists, the jihadists, the French jihadists who go to Syria, I heard that the French police assumes that roughly 20% of them are converts. That is, they choose jihadism as they probably would have chosen 30 years ago some extreme Marxist, Leninist movement. They would have been in the Red Brigades, the Baader Meinhof gang, that kind of thing. Today, the name of violent contestation of the established order is jihadism. And that should be a big concern for all of us. At the root of it is the disenfranchisement of groups. It's the disenfranchisement of individuals. In Iraq, it's clear that the reason why the Islamic State made such quick gains is that they had a lot of Sunnis who felt that when the Maliki government was looking the other way, when Shia militias were killing Sunnis, there was not much international reaction to that. There was none. And so that helped feed the radical discourse of the Islamic State that, look, the world is an immoral place, our Sunni brothers are being killed, we need to react to that. That was part of their narrative. And so,
almost as though the message is we're the only ones who care about you.
Yes.
As a recruitment tool.
It's a great recruitment tool. All the more so because of what we were saying on the information age. That is, when you're a lost soul, and I come back to Europe, when you're a lost soul in some depressing French suburb, and you might have, if it was not for the propaganda, you might have become a little gangster attacking a bank. Now, if you commit a crime, if you attack a newspaper and you're going to make world news, suddenly you feel you're a big person, you're a big man, you're part of a big fight. And you see in the psychological profile of many of those people that sense that they belong to something bigger than them. And that's a very important and very powerful recruitment tool, and a dangerous one. And I mean, you are from the media, so I'm not going. So I'm a realist. I know you're not. We cannot tell the media, or you shouldn't talk too much about it. But I think, because of course it's news, and the world is what it is. But I think at the same time, the way sometimes this threat is magnified helps the recruitment.
Mm-hmm.
And
but there's another aspect to it, okay. And I totally agree that the Shia mistreatment of the Sunni population, when we had an opportunity perhaps to have influenced that. Iraq will only have a future with majority rule and minority rights, equally carefully observed. But there is also the attraction of Islamic fundamentalism. And for many in Islam, the notion you're going back to the kind of pure religion of the 7th century. Not that anybody, I think, really has a careful handle on that, or necessarily all of the ideas and mores are part of the hadith, the sayings of the Prophet, or indeed things that are traceable. These people have taken it, managed it, moved it in a direction that is even more radical, and then used all of these horrible devices to influence world public opinion, but somehow also to continue to attract people who felt downtrodden. And here are their heroes, who are in fact pushing back the Shia, creating a new homeland, and are espousers of the purest form of the religion. So why not follow them? My own view is that already some of the Sunnis in the north are getting tired of this.
Yeah.
And the difficulty is, can we persuade the new Prime Minister of Iraq, Abadi, to open the doors of Iraq's future to the Sunni population as he is to the Shia? And one of the really difficult problems is a Shia militia, which also, in fact, is in competition for the extreme views with ISIS. And so, in effect, the poor Sunni population is dominated by one set of extremists and opposed by another. And that provides a much more difficult set of circumstances to deal with as the process goes ahead for the future.
Well, I've not noticed that extremists tend to say we'd be totally happy to have a minority position in whatever government so.
Well, no, the Sunnis for years ran Iraq as a minority, and were very unhappy about the notion that somehow majority rule should take place.
But at the same time, I mean, the issue of how do you deal with people who are, by definition, extremists, I mean, it's a real challenge.
When you look at, I mean, the appeal of the Islamic State in Syria, and Syria, with all the horrors of of the regime, is one of the most educated countries in the Middle East. It's 75% literacy rate for men and 75% roughly the same figure for women, which is quite rare in the Middle East. These people, some of them have now supported the Islamic State. But as Tom was saying, there's the appeal of utopia. But when utopia comes home and you see that these educated people can't have the basic entertainment, normal life that they are used to, very quickly some kind of backlash.
This is a race between whether the Iraqi government can change fast enough or the ISIS is going to win because their oppression is going to be seen as supportable in the face of what the Iraqi government has failed to do.
Yes.
But it's also true in Syria, Jean-Marie pointed out earlier. You had a tradition there of Alawite rule. Alawites are not Shia, but linked to Shiism in terms of their origin. So you had a minority ruling in Syria for years and years, and it was the Sunni majority who 3 years ago began to see that there were opportunities in the Arab transformation, used to be Arab Spring, to give them an opportunity to assert their interest in becoming a part of governance in the state rather than the victim of it.
We're fortunate not to be in an election year yet, but
we
are.
But we're always in an election year here.
That's true. But I'm not acknowledging it until it's 2016. But at the same time, some of the people who are thinking about running are being asked about this, and are being asked, what about a military solution, and at what point? When is there a tipping point at which the U.S. has to, or does it ever have to say, there's a point at which we really are going to have to send troops and do things beyond, surgical airstrikes and other things that are a little more antiseptic?
Yeah, well, we have troops on the ground in Iraq training Iraqis. Hopefully that will be useful and helpful. Whether we get into mission creep or not, I don't know. My own view is that we've already been in Iraq, and we've already tried this with large numbers of troops. Didn't work out very well. What's the attraction at going back?
You're asking me. Not a good idea. But there is, I think Americans sort of see themselves as, we talk about not being the world's policeman, but at the same time we again can get involved in any conflict and often do.
Yeah, but when you want to police with a military force a country, you need an enormous amount of troops and force, because all countries maintain order, and the fear of the policeman is part of the order, but 99% of the population, or 95% of the population, respects the existing order just because they think the law is right. Yeah. Otherwise the police would be overwhelmed. In France, we say la peur du gendarme est le commencement de la sagesse. The fear of the gendarme is the beginning of wisdom, but it's only the beginning. Real wisdom is to respect the law because it is the law. And if you want to establish peace in Iraq by force, without the wisdom that people believe the law is right, it requires resources that countries just don't have, even the United States. And that's why we tend to focus on the hardware of the military, because it's easier to count battalions. But the reality is that the software of politics is the most important. I mean, I was the head of peacekeeping at the United Nations, and in a way, UN interventionism is with much weaker forces than, of course, the US has. But nevertheless, there is this idea that through some deployment of peacekeepers, you are going to stabilize a country. And the one lesson I draw from that experience is that the UN, or any organization or country for that matter, can be successful only if it gets the politics right.
Yeah.
And that the military is no substitute for politics.
And the non-military piece sometimes is very large, particularly if you have a country, the structures of which have been disintegrated. There is no police, there are no kind of industry, jobs, development, agriculture.
And then you're literally building from the ground up.
Yeah.
I'm going to run through, I'm going to go on fast forward here and run through several countries, mostly in Africa, where we've talked about there's been a government breakdown, a vacuum has occurred, and Islamic State. We've talked about South Sudan, we talked about Nigeria, Somalia, Congo, Yemen, Libya, and those all are, I mean, it's the same theme over and over again, if unless I'm missing something.
Well, South Sudan was, what united South Sudan most was the fight against Sudan.
Yes, it is.
And once that fight had been won, then all the underlying problems of South Sudan emerged. And there, the UN, frankly, made the mistake that I was just alluding to. It thought that building South Sudan was just about dealing with state superstructures, building schools, and which is very good. But the political foundation wasn't there.
And the
that's
two
what
large
exploded.
tribal groups, the Nuer
Yes.
and the Dinka, unfortunately, went at each other
Yeah.
for all those kinds of historical reasons. So you had that
And there were
pushing in.
there were
And we
attacks
put-
even yesterday.
Yeah, and we put South Sudan on the list because it is not a conflict at the moment that has the kind of strategic implication that Ukraine has. But we feel, and as an organization that fights to prevent conflict, the killings, the human suffering in South Sudan is appalling. And so it's very important to put that country on the map, although it is in some ways a forgotten conflict.
I feel like I've raced across Africa in 2 minutes, and I don't mean to do that, but I did want to talk about Venezuela, which is, because of the oil industry here, there are a lot of people who are interested in what's happening there. And the $50 a barrel oil that you mentioned earlier, Ambassador, is having a much larger effect in Venezuela than it is here. Where do you see that going?
I think that Venezuela, from what little I know about it, is going to go through an increasing process of decline. And I used to go down there years ago and talk to Hugo Chavez.
Right.
And it was very clear then that the result of Chavez's intervention and control of the government was a direct, put it this way, result of the two traditional ruling parties having fallen apart. And even in the days when they should have been working together against Chavez, there didn't exist. And so the alternative to Maduro is not anything that's readily apparent on the horizon at the moment. And it is, if there is a successor, unfortunately, maybe will come from the same place with roughly the same ideas and with roughly the same sort of kind of super Chavez type populism, none of which I think is necessarily going to create a strong sense of solidity, stability, improvement, reform, and good governance. And I think it is fascinating that, of course, we, during the days of high-priced oil, in effect, because of the propinquity of Venezuela, tended to fund that particular operation,
Yes.
since they were heavily reliant on oil sales to us. Now, whether we're in a position now to use the oil weapon in reverse against Venezuela or not, I don't know, and I would want to examine much more carefully the wisdom of doing that. But you have another similar problem right across the Atlantic in Nigeria, which in my view, and having spent time there, is disintegrating before our eyes, and where the coming election is likely to be a hugely controversial and contested issue as to whether, in fact, the existing government in the Nigerian terms has rigged itself back in office, or whether they will actually go for governmental change.
What do you think when you see as what's happened in Nigeria, where, now we need to delay the election because we have a problem. I mean, that seems like the beginning of a very serious bad spiral.
It's an endemic to a country which has been the byword for corruption for a long period of time. And it's clearly indicative of the fact that the ruling group gives up power very reluctantly, and that in many ways the problems in Nigeria are serious and deep. They involve really very bad governance, really disintegration of governments. There are clear signs of some political cooperation with Boko Haram. And there are very clear signs that Boko Haram is much less of an Islamic fundamentalist organization than basically a revolution infiltrated by criminal elements.
And terrible ones.
Yeah.
Do you think the election will happen?
I hope it does, but I have no sense that there's any guarantee that they won't seek another postponement.
There's a real risk that there will be another postponement, and that would be
a
disastrous.
disaster. Because that will catalyze political forces on both sides in Nigeria.
And in Nigeria, you see a good example of that blurring of the line between politics, crime, and corruption. And that's a dangerous, that's a horrible phenomenon that makes all conflicts much harder to end.
Are you glad you came? I do want to. I wanted to end on a note that not everything that happened in 2014 as we went into 2015 was bad. That there were some good things in the report. We've talked about some of the improvements in Colombia. We have not really talked about the nuclear talks with Iran, but that's something that you see as a positive, right, Jean-Marie?
Definitely. I think there is a real hope that there will be a successful conclusion of the negotiation. I mean, it's not done until it's done, but certainly, I mean, the signs are there could be a successful negotiation, and I think if a good agreement can be concluded, it's a major positive for the region, because the tension between Iran and the West and the tension between Iran and the other countries in the region is extremely destructive. And you need to try, Iran is part of the Middle East, but we have to find a cooperative relationship between Iran and the rest of the Middle East.
You're entirely right. I remain optimistic. I think that the next stage is then to try to work out the other problems that Iran suffers from, and that we and others can play a helpful role to bring together the Middle East, not to see it come apart, which is what all of the tendencies are doing now and pushing it. And we have some common interests with Iran and Iraq against ISIS, for example.
Yes.
And in Afghanistan against the Taliban.
Okay, first question. For most of the conflicts you mentioned, the influence or impact of China seems minimal. Is this because China is continuing its policy of limited involvement outside of its region, or its influence is significant but under the radar?
I was in China, I mean, recently, and some Chinese interlocutors told me, we have no allies and we have no enemies. China wants to grow, wants to become a superpower, doesn't want to get involved in conflict, and so it's very uncomfortable when it is forced to do so.
Except for the South China Sea, where
yes.
I think there is a sensitive area, and where I think, again, it would be useful and helpful if we could convince the parties that there are settlement possibilities between them over territorial claims. Most of the parties, I think, are afraid of losing and as a result not happy to go in. But China's playing quite a large role there. And to some extent, there is within China a faction, particularly probably in the People's Liberation Army, that likes to promote a little more, put it this way, aggressive stance by China. But Jean-Marie and I were talking, you've recently been in China and Japan, and you felt that the Japanese-China thing has maybe gone down a little bit rather than gone up.
Yeah, it's better today than it was a year ago. I mean, I think both countries, I mean, they're not going to agree anytime soon on the substance of their dispute, on the maritime dispute, but they understand the risk of escalation. And so they have taken some practical measures to contain them. And That's one little good news in
That's a form.
2014.
That's a form of progress. Next question, why is there silence from the United Nations? And we haven't mentioned the United Nations at all tonight. Why is there silence on ISIS and on most world problems? I guess maybe the question is how significant is the United Nations as a body right now?
Well, it depends what you call the United Nations. Because the United Nations, it's a lot of disunited countries.
The member states.
It's its member states. And so the Security Council, and Tom could talk about it better than anybody, having been the representative of the United States on the Council for a number of, at a critical time. The Security Council is as powerful as its unity is. And at the moment, the Security Council is deeply divided. So it's impossible, it's not very hard, it's impossible for the Security Council to take a strong position on issues where it disagrees.
But I thought the Security Council made some tough statements on ISIS.
Yes.
The real problem is in your profession. They don't report the United Nations.
It's true.
You know, it's the problem with any positive story. It doesn't rise to the top.
You see, we could talk about that later, but we're not going to talk about it now.
But it's true that on anti-terrorism, this is one of the areas where actually, I mean, I was in China and Japan recently. The countries disagree on a lot of things, but you talk to Europeans, you talk to the United States, you talk to Russia, you talk to China, you talk to Japan, there is a common concern.
Please comment on Pakistan versus India.
Well, maybe I should do that a little bit. I have spent some time in India and Pakistan. Pakistan and India have a unique opportunity to talk. And that was spoiled at the time of the inauguration of the new Prime Minister of India by what is best called a super misunderstanding. The Pakistanis came and talked to the Kashmiris, which they had done previously, with the permission or at least the support or non-objection of the Indian government. But for the new Prime Minister, this was an anathema. And so he's broken off the conversations. And my feeling is that it makes some sense for the world quietly to encourage those conversations to get back together again. Pakistan is suffering from having created, in fact, a Frankenstein monster in its own territory by supporting the Taliban in Afghanistan, and the Taliban in Pakistan arose to join the crowd, and they're now dealing with it. That gives Pakistan and India, for the first time, a few pieces of common interest in this particular issue. But there are so many gaps and so many differences between them. My own view is that if they could be quietly encouraged, there are solutions even to Kashmir, which rivals Israeli-Arab problems in intractability. But I think at the moment the world is focused on a whole lot of other things and maybe in too much of a reactive mode to pick up on it. So I worry. I think that Pakistan and India, with real serious accidents and misunderstanding, could actually lead to nuclear use. And we ought to be concerned about it.
We should always be concerned about it.
And therefore, we ought to be able to take, put it this way, a more positive and encouraging position with respect to getting the Indians to now excuse the Pakistani error and reopen the conversations. And there's some indications that might come. But once that begins, they have developed an enormous capacity to meet, discuss, and go away, only agreeing to meet again. And so there has to be put into the mix here some sense of whether, in fact, there aren't bridges they can build together rather than talks they can continue together. And so that will be the next big problem in dealing with a place like Kashmir. And it's been fascinating because India and Pakistan have 5 or 6 smaller problems they could resolve right away. And the thought has always been, let's get the small problem solved, the atmosphere will get better, and they can deal with the big one. And of course, the small problems have always managed to avoid solution. So in fact, built into each society is a notion that if we can't get our perfect solution, nothing else can work.
That's very difficult.
So
and
I leave
creative.
you on a note of supreme optimism about it all.
Yeah, it sounds like it. The more we talk, the worse it gets.
Yeah.
How do the Kurds fit into the Middle East?
Well, the Kurds did
Badly.
I understand badly. How might they fit in well futurely?
they did not get their state when the Ottoman Empire ended at the end of World War I. And you find Kurds in 4 countries. You find them in Turkey, you find them in Iran, you find them in Iraq, and you find them in Syria. And all those 4 countries have no interest whatsoever in a Kurdish state. The Kurds have played their cards quite well so far. And so they are less further away today from having a Kurdish state than they've ever been since the end of World War I.
You know, I think you could say, Jean-Marie, that in effect, northeastern Iraq is an undeclared,
De facto.
unrecognized, but de facto Kurdish state.
Yeah.
That that now is moving over into northern Syria to Kobani and places of that sort, where the Kurds are seen as probably the first line of defense against ISIS, at least in terms of protecting their own territory. I think Turkey would be enraged if, in fact, that crept into their territory. And in fact, there are Turks in northern Iraq making sure that it doesn't. And finally, I think the Iranians have no interest in fact, taking their part of Kurdistan and lumping it together in some new Kurdish state.
Certainly not.
So that all is going to stay in an uncertain position.
That doesn't sound promising at all. I'd like to hear something a little more promising.
And sometimes ambiguity is the least bad
Better
solution.
solution. And not every problem can be resolved by independent states. If we took that as an example, every little village in the Balkans would want to be an independent
its own nation. I think we've got 4 minutes, maybe one more question.
Well, we can do 4 questions.
We can do 4 questions. We'll have the speed round. What is one of the forgotten conflicts that Crisis Group focuses on, and what are you doing to make the world focus on resolving it?
Well, I mean, we recently, it's not a conflict, it's a pre-conflict. We issued a few months ago a report on Cameroon. Nobody is interested in Cameroon. But Cameroon is a typical example of a country with little prospect of a renewal of the political class, with enormous underlying problems. Now Boko Haram nibbling at parts of Cameroon. So this is a typical situation of a country that really doesn't make even the page 5 of newspapers, but that could tomorrow be one other failed country.
Even though it has a president for life.
Yes, maybe.
Or perhaps because. But that again is another common theme that we've talked about with all of these countries. So a thing that you're looking for is evidence that a government is not keeping up its end of the bargain.
And it's so much, I mean, less difficult to engage in those countries before they have fallen apart. And we repeatedly make the mistake of not doing that.
Yeah.
Okay. What about, and I can't believe we haven't mentioned either of these places either, but what about Israel and the Palestinians, and what's the latest on that?
That's a couple of hours.
Do you have time? Do you have time?
The last effort by Senator Kerry didn't prosper. The really interesting question is, after the elections in Israel on March 17th, who will be the prime minister? And whether whoever is prime minister, Netanyahu or Herzog, whether in fact there will be then an interest in moving. My own view, which is certainly schismatic, if not worse, is that if there is no progress that can be made, because each party is dug in where it is, then it might be time to take Senator Kerry's work, which was very extensive, and formulate that into a U.S. position, which would not be a diktat, but would outline basically the scope within which negotiations, in our view, could succeed. And my own view is that at some point, if the parties are not prepared to work with us and others along those lines, with full freedom to negotiate what they want, but with our ideas before them, then we probably should take it to the UN Security Council.
Okay. What's, do you have a...
And the value of that is not that the Security Council can force the parties to accept the position, but the imprimatur of the Security Council can give, put it this way, long life, persuasive quality, and durability to the proposals, particularly if they're seen to be close to the center of the compromises that have to be made.
What's your sense of how the election is going to turn out?
I think that it's Bibi's to lose, but the reports are that Herzog is certainly, and his side of the political spectrum, still in there, and close enough not to see it as a slam dunk.
Did his speech this week, did it
I
help him or
haven't
hurt him?
seen the reports from Israel, which is where it counts.
Right.
The reports from here is that everybody who loves Bibi thought it was splendid, and everybody who doesn't like Bibi didn't think it was splendid.
I might have guessed that was the outcome before the speech.
Before speech, yeah.
Exactly. So some beeper went off. It is now 8 o'clock. And I was, as I said, I was told to finish on time, and so this seems like it would be a good place to finish.
Terrific.
Thank you, everybody.